I'm Dr. Randall Smith, and for about the last 25 years I've had the privilege of traveling the lands of Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and Italy as we've been exploring the lands of the Bible. For about the last decade, we've been putting these kinds of journeys on tape, and you'll see now notebooks in hands of students in all of these countries as they begin to study how the places affect our understanding of the Bible. We hope in this series you'll be able to pick up some of that excitement as you see the archaeology and the history and the geography, and as it comes together for your understanding of what the Bible meant to the people that originally experienced God in the text. It's a busy Sunday morning here in the springtime in Jerusalem. Today the traffic fills the streets around these beautiful parks that surround our city. This one at Yemen Moshe helps to remind us that there's a green belt all around the city of Jerusalem even today. And ever since it was established in the 1860s with the large windmill behind me, this area has been a quarter not only for the working class but also for artists and artisans today. We're going to be looking in these next few segments at how Jesus revealed himself to people in the city of Jerusalem and around the country. If God put on human skin and wanted to come and reveal himself to us, if the work of Jesus was all about making the Father known to us, how did he do it? We're going to look at it in two parts. Our first part will be addressing what Jesus said, the 7 I am sayings of Jesus. The second part will address more, what did Jesus do? What were the signs that he gave us, or what we'll call the 7 I do's of John's Gospel. Jesus was actually part of two very different worlds, and the background of the Gospels is a canvas of where these two worlds meet. On the one hand was the Greco-Roman tradition that was consumed with form. The great statuary we have of the human past is really Greek classical tradition statuary. It derived from the earliest times with the pharaohs in Egypt and pulled from those resources, but became statuary of the whole form. As the classical period of the Greeks came into its own, about 500 years before Jesus, they began to search out all of the form of the body. At the same time, the Hebrew mind was very different. Jesus himself was actually part of the Hebrew world, a functional world where you're known by what you do, not by what you look like. It's not easy for a person who comes from the West to really comprehend and understand the way a biblical person would think. Simple, different ways of understanding the same written word are an illustration of why living in this culture and understanding something of its background is important. The writer of the Gospel of John gives us a setting for Jesus' story, and he tells it in two ways. He gives 7 different I am statements. This, of course, would help the Greeks among the audience to understand who Jesus is based on what Jesus says he is. Jesus speaking about Jesus. But for the Hebrew mind, that wasn't sufficient. He had to give them more than just the words of Jesus. He had to give them the works of Jesus. And so rather than just give him samples of what Jesus preached, like Matthew gives abundantly, John's Gospel also includes 7 specific miracles selected out of all the things that Jesus did. In fact, John's Gospel says, many other things truly did Jesus that are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe, and in believing have life. He tips his hand at the beginning of exactly what it is he's trying to do. He says, I'm going to write the things that will help you to believe. If you're a Greek, you need the things Jesus said. If you're a Hebrew, you need the things that he did. But in either case, I'm going to give them to you in a way that you can believe. And when you believe, you'll have life. Let's take a few moments and investigate the background of some of the sayings of Jesus' I am sayings. Remember, there are 7 of the I am sayings of Jesus, and the very first one is in chapter 6. It's set on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee, and the setting gives us the I am the bread of life saying. The story is that Jesus parted bread and fish and fed 5,000 people at the beginning of John chapter 6 on the northern shore, someplace near here. Sometime later, the next day, a crowd came back to Jesus looking for more bread and another miracle. John chapter 6 says it this way, verse 22. The day following, when the people stood on the side of the sea, they saw that there was no other boat there except for the one the disciples had entered in. And Jesus went not with his disciples in the boat, but his disciples were gone away alone. Howbeit there came together boats from Tiberias near unto the place where they did eat the bread, after the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they came to Capernaum, seeking Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said, How did you get here, Rabbi? Jesus answered and said unto them, Truly, truly, I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat the loaves and were filled. Labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. For him hath God the Father sealed. Then said they unto him, What shall we do that we might work the works of God? And Jesus answered and said unto them, This is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent. And they asked him, What sign do you show us? What work do you do? Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. But Jesus said to them, Truly, truly, I say to you, Moses did not give you that bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which comes down from heaven and gives unto the world. Then said they unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. This is a classic Middle Eastern story. People got something on one day, so they got in a boat and came back to see if they could get some more the next day. They looked for Jesus. They couldn't find him. They followed him all the way over to Capernaum. All this so they could get some free loaves of bread and some more fish. They had been filled up with the food, and they were so satisfied they thought, hey, someone's giving away a free lunch. Let's go find him. Jesus really didn't want to do tricks for the crowd. And he really wanted them to understand something about himself. They tried to bait him into doing the miracle again, even offering that Moses had given manna in the wilderness, and Jesus pointed out, oh no, Moses didn't give you manna, my Father in heaven gave you manna. And even now, the sign that I can give you is a sign of myself. I am the bread of life. Bread in the Hebrew mind is that which represents the needs of our life. Now I'm holding in my hands bread made with wheat. That would have been the bread of the wealthy people of the Bible. Most people ate bread that was barley loaves, like the ones earlier in John chapter 6. Those are the bread for the poor. In fact, the bread is the staple existence of life. Here, many Middle Easterners eat actually by scooping with bread. They don't even have any cutlery on the table. So the bread becomes that which represents all of our needs. Give us this day our daily bread is a way to say, give us the needs of our life. Remember, at the table, the blessing to God for the bread is that which represents all that I need. And that blessing has been done the same way for generations. It's done by taking the bread and raising it up so you can just see underneath of it. And the blessing in Hebrew is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotze lechem min haaretz. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. When you handle the bread, it's a sacred item. So we normally break bread. We don't cut the bread. It's a respect to show that this represents the needs of our life. What was our real need? Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I want you to believe on me. I want to become a part of who you are. You know, when you eat something, it becomes part of who you are. I want you to ingest who I am and allow me to come inside you and become part of you so that I can live through you. The real need of my life, the essential truth that Jesus wanted to get across was that I needed him more than I needed any other kind of bread. He was the substance that I really needed to long for. The next several I am sayings take place within one setting. They're in Jerusalem. The time is the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. A sukkah is a small shack that you build next to your house to remember the time reflected in the desert, the Exodus experience. Here in the harsh Judean wilderness, we've had the opportunity to build an entire replica of the tabernacle. Behind me is a goat hair tent made by some Bedouin local to the area of the Ta'amre tribe. Leviticus 23 names Sabbath and then each of the major feasts that God commanded the Jewish people to keep. All of them are listed there except for Purim, which comes later, and Hanukkah, which comes later. But God commanded that they would keep a series of festivals and feasts, and 3 of those festivals and feasts include times when they should go up, according to Deuteronomy 16:16, to Jerusalem for observance. One of those was Passover. Another was the Feast of Shavuot, or Feast of Weeks. We call it Pentecost in the church. And of course, the other one was the Feast of Tabernacles, that one that is set during the autumn of the year. It's interesting to me that Leviticus 23 says, "And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles, for 7 days unto the Lord. For the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. 7 days shall you offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, and on the 8th day shall be a holy convocation unto you, and you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly, and you shall do no servile work therein. These are the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy times or convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt sacrifice, a meat offering, a sacrifice and drink offering, everything upon his day, beside the Sabbaths of the Lord, and beside your gifts, and beside all your vows, and beside all your freewill offerings which you give unto the Lord. You shall keep the feast of the Lord 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in all your generations. You shall celebrate it on the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I took them through the wilderness." God commanded that in the 7th month every year, for 7 days, Israel would be taken back to the time when they lived in tents like these, when their existence was in this hot desert by day. The hot winds blowing off the desert were part of what they experienced daily. When their provision was the manna of the wilderness. They touched the heart of God by walking on the very edge of their own lives. You know, there's something about the desert in the Bible that is a clarifying point for people. Whether it's Elijah that went out into the desert to hear a still small voice that he couldn't hear in the busy city. Jesus himself came into the wilderness of Judah, and there he had an opportunity to come alone, and eventually was tested by the devil. The children of Israel came through the desert. John the Baptizer rose up out of the desert. The desert is integral to the heart of those who would find God and know God and be able to meet with him. There's something about the character of the desert that allows God to speak more clearly to a person than they can hear in the normal everyday workaday life. Perhaps it's the fact that we live on the edge of our own lives out here in the desert. To be released into the desert without friends means to die. You need hospitality out here. It's the only way you can survive. It's interesting to me that God called his people to come out here to a desert, and there he formed them as a nation. Here in the book of Leviticus, we're told that Israel is to go back to that desert experience every year. And every child that is born, a child of the sons of Israel, must remember that they were formed as a nation in the desert. In the crucible of the desert, God made himself clear. There was never a worse time to be an Israelite than that time in the desert in terms of the physical experience. But there was never a better time to be an Israelite in terms of meeting God, seeing him in a pillar of fire, seeing him in a cloud, knowing that he was walking with you. Even the bread of the presence of the tabernacle was put there by the manna that he supplied daily. God never left us in the middle of that dry, hot, burning desert. It's amazing to me that God's provision was so clear to the Israelites, and so every year in Sukkot they were taken back to live in tents. The rabbis taught, happy is a man who sits wet in his sukkah, because one of the things you do at Sukkot is pray for rain. As we think about that time the Israelites went through the desert, when they got into their land, God said, you remember every year you used to dwell in tents. Live outside in those tents once a year for 7 days. Eat your meals out there, and remember that it's from that background that you were formed as a nation. The tent behind me is made of goat hair. The goats have been carefully sheared, and then these are all handmade tents. Now, if I were sitting inside this tent, the intense sun that's out here on my face would be showing through like little twinkles between these little open weaves that are here. This is a very intelligent weave because during the time that it's dry, it opens up so that this tent actually breathes. But when it's very cold and when the wet comes down in the rainy season and the rains fall, the weave closes so the water runs off the outside. Do you remember there's a phrase in Hebrew called the canopy of the heavens? It's literally the tent of the heavens. If you look up at the heavens at night, the stars twinkle through, just like the lights would show through this canopy above you. And your sukkah is made according to very specific rabbinic tradition and law. You have to be able to see the stars through the slats in the roof. And during Sukkot, there's a marvelous time at the time of Jesus to come to the temple. It's one of the times you were called to come up to the temple. Now during this time, Jesus is remembering some of the specific things that go on in the temple setting. Standing here in this replica of the wilderness tabernacle, you can hear the creaking of the building as the winds whistle by. Remember that Jesus' I am the light of the world saying was set not in the tabernacle, but in the temple. In the temple, they had a similar menorah, although it was probably much taller than the one that comes from the tabernacle. This is a replica of the one that comes from that portable shrine and had to be moved from place to place. And of course, being made of gold, it was quite heavy. A beautiful place to remember this is the marvelous model built by the Holy Land Hotel, which overlooks the city of Jerusalem in the west. This model unfolds the best view of the temple and the city as it looked in 66 in the Common Era, just a little while after the time of Jesus. In the model, you can see a broad Gentile court with a vast colonnade. The southern porch stands 3 floors high above the ground with 1 floor below. As you look at the model of the temple, remember that Jesus' time in the Festival of Tabernacles was largely spent in the temple precinct. It's in the midst of this that Jesus will stand up and say, if you're looking for the light, I am the light of the world. The important thing about Jesus' I am the light of the world saying is that the Feast of Tabernacles is a feast in which you remember the transporting through the desert of the children of Israel and God's watching over them. During that time, in memorial of the time in the desert, the women's court menorahs were kept lit through the night. The lampstands burned all night long in the temple. It's in this backdrop that Jesus comes into the temple and says, I am the light of the world. Remember, he's not only going to say this, he's going to back it up by healing a man who was blind, and he was able to spit on the ground and make clay of the spittle and tell him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. But the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, pulls you back to that time so long ago in the desert. And this menorah or lampstand reminds you that inside the temple, the light for the entire holy place was nothing more than a lampstand like this. Later on in that same week, Jesus will use 2 shepherding images. He'll go down to a setting near the Siloam pools and see a man kicked out for being healed on the wrong day, and he'll talk about the good shepherd and being the door of the sheep. You couldn't help but understand shepherding and sheep by coming and going in and out of Jerusalem. I mean, after all, Jerusalem is surrounded by hills that are covered with sheep. The life of a shepherd is a simple life. Out here in the desert, sometimes they spend their time in the sheepfolds or out on the hills. They walk for a lot of the time, but when they can, they come back home to the tent. This is a simple Bedouin tent sitting out here in the Judean desert. The Bedouin are the original Arab, the people that come from the Sinai Peninsula, and they're the people today that are largely the shepherds of the land. The ancient Israelite probably lived somewhat similar to the way they live. Probably the most important thing about the Bedouin in their lifestyle is that it's so incredibly simple. We should remember that the person of the Bible was like this as well. They didn't have a lot of things. In fact, the Bedouins say if they have a mattress and a coffee pot, they have everything they need to live. The shepherd goes away from home with his sheep, and often he'll walk 3 or 4 days away from the home. And so he will have to find a place to keep the sheep safe. Normally he'll put them in a cave, like a sheepfold, and put some rocks up along the front and then just lie in the doorway. Jesus uses this illustration for the next 2 of the I am sayings of John. In fact, the background of this saying was the man that was blind, and Jesus healed him and said, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." After the man was healed, there were those who rejected Jesus because of the testimony of this man. In fact, they ejected this man from the community simply because he was following after Jesus had healed him. Jesus wanted to make a special point in these I am sayings about what it meant to be a good shepherd versus the kind of shepherd that he was seeing of the flock of the house of Israel. The background for Jesus' saying is in Ezekiel 34. The prophet Ezekiel had spoken out against those who were in charge of Israel, the shepherds of Israel, as it were, and said, "You have become like hirelings. You have left my sheep to be diseased. You have not taken care of them, but one will come, a good shepherd, one will come and take care of my sheep the way I say they should be taken care of." So in this background, Jesus says in John chapter 10, "Truly, truly I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. He shall go in and out and find pasture." Jesus is trying to communicate not only that he is the access to the Father, but also that if one would want to come in and out and be protected and comforted, this shepherd is not one who is longing to throw them out, but rather longing that they would be inside and safe. He's contrasting his nature with the nature of those religious teachers that are tossing this man out because they don't agree with where he's gone. Jesus wants him to feel included, loved, and forgiven, and cared for. Now, if you go on with the story, it says, "I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. The thief cometh not, but for to steal, and to kill, and to destroy. I am come that you might have life, and that you may have it more abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. But he that is a hireling, and not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth. And the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. The hireling fleeth, because he is a hireling, and careth not for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. As the Father knoweth me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd." In this passage, Jesus goes further. The "I am the good shepherd" saying is the first time Jesus opens the door to a new flock, a flock not of the house of Israel. You and me, who are not from a Jewish background, but rather came to know Messiah because of the work that he did. He gave his life and then opened up to be a good shepherd, not only for the household of Israel, as Ezekiel had promised would come, but one that would reach out even into my world as well. When Jesus says, "I am the door," he says 2 very important things. I am the access to the Father, and I am the protector of the sheep. I remember some years ago when a shepherd took me out in the wilderness, and I was looking at the sheepfold, and I saw that he had erected the wall around the front, but there was no door. And I said, "How do you protect the sheep? Where's the door?" And he said, "I am the door." I've never forgotten that, because it reminds me that the shepherd himself lies in the doorway so that no fox or any kind of rodent can bother the sheep. I think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was there to pray, and the disciples went to sleep. The 3rd time they woke up to the sound of the soldiers, the Roman cohort backed up by the temple guard. Jesus got up and said, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "Then let the others go." In the midst of his own arrest, he was concerned about the sheep around him, holding his flock. Remember that the context of this passage is that this man who was healed was being thrown away by the injustice of his shepherds, or so-called hireling shepherds. Rather, Jesus, as a good shepherd, wanted to pull people in, give them access, and protect them as a good shepherd would. The fifth of the settings of the I am sayings in the Gospel of John is set not in Sukkot, but sometime later. Jesus has been in Jerusalem a number of times in the last 6 months of his ministry. He was there for the Feast of Tabernacles. He was there again for Hanukkah. But the next setting is not in Jerusalem, but nearby in Bethany. That's the setting of the raising of Lazarus. I'm standing now in Bethany, the ever-growing community called Elazaria, Lazarus. It takes its name from its most important and most famous person, Lazarus, who was raised from the dead in John 11 by Jesus. Remember that Jesus has already told his disciples about such terrible calamities as political persecution of Pilate and the falling of a tower. He's told them that there would be only a certain limited time that God would allow them to repent, or that they would be like that fig tree. He's even urged them to understand the priorities of God that are different than the priorities of men. But probably the central teaching in all of the last preparation stage would be the intimate teachings Jesus gave in front of his friends, Mary and Martha, as they gathered together at the tomb of Lazarus. By the time of the 4th century, in 324, Eusebius already tells us that the site of the resurrection of Lazarus was a well-known place. Jerome, when he does his Latin Vulgate translation in the 390s in Bethlehem, tells us that there was a church in existence here at Bethany. That early church was destroyed in the 5th century by an earthquake just at the end of the 5th century. And it wasn't until much, much later that the Crusaders would come and shore up these walls and build these large entranceways in and out of the tomb. The tomb is just outside this wall, but now has been blocked up because over time the Crusaders lost control of the area and it fell into Muslim hands. Muslims built a mosque next door and blocked up these entrances to get into the tomb. And now the entrance to the tomb is out from the front street, outside of the church property and underneath the mosque, an entrance that was cut in the 1500s. The modern church that stands on the site stands above these nice colorful mosaics that are in the floor, as well as these old walls, some from the Byzantine period and some from the Crusader period. The traditional site for the tomb of Lazarus has been here and known since the 300s. This is one of many sites that we call traditional sites. Remember, there are always 3 questions you need to ask when we look at a site that we're not sure if it's the actual site. First, is the event being remembered a public event or a private event? The more people that were there, the more likely they remember the exact place where something happened. Second, is it an event that people in the New Testament period care to remember? Is it important enough to be remembered? And third, is there continuous occupation of people who care about the event? In other words, if it's an event that happens in the life of Jesus, is it something where people who are Christian continue to live in that area, continuously occupying the area through the centuries? If all of the Christians leave for 500 years, the likelihood they remember the exact stone where something happened is diminished because they've been away so much. The tomb of Lazarus today is accessed through a deep cavern, many stairs to go down. But in the New Testament period, it would have been much closer to the surface. As a result of the building of the mosque and the changes of the buildings around it, it's now very, very deep and dark down into this ancient tomb. Deep inside the crypt of Lazarus' tomb, we're reminded that Bethany was a suburb of Jerusalem throughout the New Testament period, and because of that, it had a cosmopolitan flavor. A very large church was built here in the Byzantine period called the Lazarium. We don't know for sure if we're in the right tomb, but we do understand that the tombs of the area are someplace on this ridge, and we're at the edge of Bethany. This tomb probably would have been originally a rolling stone style, although there were tombs that had a top plate and were opened in this way. Jesus called for Lazarus to come forth out of the tomb. No small feat for someone who's wrapped from their feet all the way up to their shoulders. Remember that they would take the body and cleanse it and spice it, and then wrap the body from the feet up to the shoulders and then around the head, allowing the neck to remain open so that the body had a place to drain its fluids. And then sometime later they would come in and check the body, and usually 18 months later they would gather up the bones and put them in with the fathers, and that would be the secondary burial. If Lazarus was truly wrapped like this, probably the hardest thing for him to do was to obey Jesus and to come out wrapped like this. It's a tight opening, and it's not so easy to get in and out of. John 11 is remembered in a setting that is now a crypt-like church in Bethany. This cruciform church reminds us that the power of the resurrection is found in the cross. It's a very strange-looking church at first observation. There are no windows here. This is a closed crypt. Behind me, the altar looks like a coffin, and above, the resurrection and the life stands as the centerpiece of the artwork. The side walls reveal some of the other parts of the story of Bethany. Jesus talking to the busy Martha and the listening Mary, Lazarus coming forth out of the tomb, Jesus being anointed with that special ointment of spikenard at a meal in Bethany. Antonio Barluzzi in the 1950s built this church to sound and feel cold like a crypt, so that we might remember that the life that is given to us by Jesus himself. Probably the most important teaching Jesus will give will be that teaching about the resurrection and the life. Mary and Martha had misunderstood in John 11, and they were weeping because Lazarus had died. And then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, whatsoever you will ask of God, God will give it to you. Jesus said to her, your brother shall rise again. Martha said to him, I know he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. But Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, which should come into the world. So the place here that recalls the Lazarium, the celebration of the resurrection and the life, is essentially a cornerstone to our understanding of who Jesus is. He's the God that gives life from death. The final settings, the last two of the 7 I am sayings in the Gospel of John, are set in the upper room. Someplace in the city, perhaps near here, where this building now stands, Jesus spent his last hours with his disciples. Those last hours with Jesus, the disciples were listening to some of the most important words Jesus would ever utter. And in that setting, he would be able to talk to them about who he was. He knew he had only hours with them. And so he told them that he was the way, the truth, and the life, and that no man could come to the Father except by him. He also explained to them a relationship they could have with the Father by means of an illustration on the walk from the upper room to Gethsemane. He stopped by a vineyard. The story of the vine and branches gave an insight into 3 specific relationships for the disciples. Jesus knew that the disciples were facing a time without him, without the closeness of his comforting presence. They knew that they would need direction. They had no idea where they were going or how they would experience fulfillment or how the project of bringing the kingdom message to the world could be accomplished without Jesus' presence. And he kept telling them, I'm going away now. I'll be gone from you. In fact, the disciples even asked him on one occasion, how can we come with you and how do we know the way to go? Jesus knew that there were 3 specific relationships they would need to understand. He said that his Father was the husbandman. I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away, and every branch that beareth fruit, he tends it, that it may bring forth more fruit. The disciples knew what the job of the vine-tending husbandman was. The husbandman was the one who planned the entire vineyard. He's the one who chose the angle of all of the arbors and the way the grapes would be placed so that they would bring forth the most fruit. He picked out the terraces and tore up the ground and provided all of the background and the setting for the vines. The husbandman was not only responsible for planting and planning and ordering the rows, but he was also responsible for keeping all of the branches clean. You notice when you look in a vineyard that the natural way for a branch to grow is downward toward the mud and the dirt, all toward the dust of the field. But dirty branches don't produce any fruit. And so it's the job of the husbandman to prune off and to clean off and to keep up the branches and to cleanse the branches that get down into the dirt. The husbandman plans and plants. The husbandman cleans, but he also prunes. One of the important jobs is to be able to cut away anything that would impede the growth on the branch. The branches tend to produce a lot of foliage and very little fruit. And only by careful pruning does the husbandman make sure that the foliage is cut to a minimum, but the fruit is at a maximum. It's important to remember that the husbandman is always tending for one purpose. The cutting away of these branches is not to hurt the branch. It's to bring forth more fruit. What a gentle reminder to the disciples that some things in their life would be taken away. Some of the relationships and some of the important elements of who they were would be stripped off by God. But his purpose was never to be cruel. It was always to bring forth fruit in their lives. When you look at these branches and you see how much work it is for the husbandman to prune them and to keep them up and keep them clean, you understand what the Father's job is and how he would work in their lives to bring forth fruit. But there's a second relationship that Jesus also wanted the disciples to understand, and that was that he was the vine. Jesus comes back to that image. In John 15, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch, and is withered. And men gather them, and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, you shall ask what you will, and it shall be done unto you. Herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit, so shall you be my disciples. Just as his Father would plan and order, clean and prune, the vine would be that which would draw from the soil, from places where the branch could not get of its own any kind of nutrients. The vine would do the work of drawing out and sucking out of the soil those things that were necessary. The vine was responsible to produce the energy, to produce all of the nutrients, to produce the life for the branch. But it was the branch's job to cling to the vine. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it abide in the vine, no more can ye except you abide in me. The one thing that the branch had to do was to cling tightly to the vine, to allow itself to be washed and to keep itself from down in the dirt and growing in its natural tendencies. Jesus was telling the disciples something very pointed. If you grow the way that you would grow naturally, you'll not produce fruit for me. But if you'll grow according to the gentle touch of the husbandman, and according to the nutrients that you can draw from me as the vine, then you can produce much fruit. And you've not chosen me. I've chosen you that you would bring forth fruit. My intention is that you would have an impact, and that you would in fact bring forth great fruit, great works, not because you're such a great branch, but because you've allowed yourself to be tended by a great husbandman, and you've drawn your strength from an incredible vine. Jesus was fully exposed in the Gospel of John, both in what he said and what he did. In this segment, we've tried to look at these 7 I am sayings and help understand just a little bit of the setting and background of each one. We conclude our remarks really with thinking about the meaning of them. Why are these 7 the 7 statements that John picks out? I mean, John is trying to give you things that will help you believe and understand the important truths of who Jesus was. Each of these 7 statements, like the 7 things Jesus does in the next segment, will reveal something specific about who Jesus is. I am the bread of life is not only an echo toward that time when we would remember the communion service and the Eucharist and the bread and cup, but you remember in the ancient Hebrew table, and even today, there are blessings over the bread and cup, thanking God for the bread, the image of the things that we need in our lives, and the cup, the image of the joys of our life, the things He gives us that we don't need, but He's a good God and He gives them to us. I am the bread of life was like saying, I am the need of your life. The priority to a believer is that we would know Jesus. You know, I often think of it this way. As a believer, you can get a lot of theology wrong. The one thing you can't afford to get wrong is, who is Jesus and what does he mean in salvation? To answer that question incorrectly changes eternity. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, there was next to him a man who believed. There was next to him a man who didn't believe he was who he said he was. And that made all the difference in their destiny. So ultimately it comes down to, what do you believe about Jesus? I am the bread of life drives home the point, I am what you really need. And apart from me, you can do nothing. The second of the 7 settings is, I am the light of the world. And this John gives us to help remind us that we live in darkness. And it's only by understanding and knowing him that we can be able to see things as they really are. In fact, we've made reference before to the fact that faith means seeing the world as God says it is. The only proper way I can see the things that God has created is by seeing them through his word and understanding what he has said they are, or seeing them through the eyes of Jesus, because he's the one that gives them light. Jesus goes on in John's gospel and says he's the door of the sheep. He's the real entry in and out. He's the gateway to the kingdom. So many are uncomfortable with this teaching of Jesus. We all like to think that there are many paths in which I can get to God, and there's lots of different people doing it different ways, but Jesus is very exclusive in his message. It is hard to get around the saying of Jesus that there is a door, and I am the door. In fact, later on, Jesus goes on in that same setting and talks about being the good shepherd. And remember, there had been a man kicked out of the area of the synagogue because he was healed on the wrong day of the week. Jesus drives home the point that a good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. He's about including them. He's about drawing them into the presence of God. Hirelings are about kicking them out or running away when troubles come. Jesus also tells us that he's the resurrection and the life. And this setting in the Bethany really is one that seems so obvious about what he wants to tell us. We're dead apart from him. But with him, we can have life, and we can have it eternally. Jesus finishes up his sayings with, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And very importantly, no man comes to the Father but by me. He doesn't offer many paths to heaven, but he offers one that's safe and secure. I am the way. And finally, in the last of the 7 I am sayings, Jesus talks about being the true vine. And remember that when God tended that vine, the husbandman, the one that caused us to be able to have the nutrients drawn from the soil, God gave us an opportunity to live out life the way he intended it to be. Ever since the fall and ever since the story of Adam, man was living in a fallen world surrounded by fallen people with no real access to a steady flow of the Spirit of God and life in him. With the coming of Jesus, the true vine, we had the opportunity now to partake of the abundant life right now. So each of these 7 settings helps us to understand something about who Jesus says he is. And that's why we say it's Jesus on Jesus.